Hi, everybody. My name's Jay Agner. Welcome to the First Customer Podcast. We talk to founders about, you guessed it, how they got their first customer. This episode and every episode is sponsored by my company, JDAQA Software Testing. We're your one-stop shop for manual, automated, performance, and security testing. Check us out at jdaqa.com. And with that, let's get on with the show. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the First Customer Podcast. My name's Jay Agner. Today, I'm lucky enough to be joined by Nick Balée from Project Talent Group. Nick, how are you, buddy?
Hey, I'm doing well, Jay. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, you got it. So Tulane graduate. I see you jumped around a bunch through BizDev and a bunch of sales stuff along the way. So let's just kind of get started. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to high school and stuff?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Brazil. So I was born in Brazil. My dad is a cultural anthropologist and lived there for 10 years after his PhD at Columbia. And my mom is Brazilian, was working in a museum. They got married, and then I moved here. I moved to New Orleans when I was 4 years old. So grew up in New Orleans. Dad's a professor at Tulane. I went to public school, K through 8. Then I went to Brother Martin High School for high school, and then I went to Tulane. So graduated Tulane in 2010. And New Orleans is a pretty cool place to grow up. I played a lot of chess as a kid, tournaments. I was actually professionally trained by an international master.
Wow.
And as a kid, I used to write business plans. So I've always wanted to have my own business. But I remember when I was 12, I would just I had this. I forget what that game was called. I think it was called Payday.
Okay.
I don't know if you remember that game or not, but you could have these little business cards, and you would land on a square, and it would give you a company, and then you could start building an empire and things like
Wow.
that. So I used to play the game by myself and write out plans and things like that. And so I went to Brazil after college. So I got my undergraduate degree in history and went down to Brazil and studied in the Amazon. And actually, I started a company down there with the indigenous tribe that my dad got famous with. They're called the Kaapor Indians. So he did a lot of anthropological work down there, but I basically started a company to reforest the Amazon because there's a lot of lumbering organizations going in and cutting down their trees. So they offer them money in exchange for taking their wood. So I offered them money for the seeds from the trees, and then sent them to reforestation companies. And it was bought them at 50%, sold it for 100, and then had kind of an operational
Wow.
business going.
That is a story out of left field. I try to do my homework a little bit on these calls. I would have had no idea that was something you did. That's pretty cool. What was the name of that company?
Yeah, it was called the Association of
Okay.
Gudapi Indians. It was a nonprofit. I wouldn't really call it a company, but it was sustainable. We were trying to create a sustainable environment to reforest the Amazon. And ultimately, that's not what I wanted to do long term. And Brazil, it was great to go back down there. I lived there for a year after college because I went a few times in high school and middle school. But my mom's side of the family lives down there, so I spent a whole year traveling the whole country. I did a lot of archaeological sites. I thought I was going to be an archaeologist. That was going to maybe follow my dad's footsteps. But I've always had a passion, for business. That was kind of so when I started doing that company, I was like, wow, my godfather actually helped me do it, but he had tried to get this set up for 10 years, and then I went
And
in
what?
and did it in 3
How old
months.
were you when you did that? Wow. So yeah, you
22.
did get started early. The history degree. I'm curious because I thought I wanted to be a history teacher when I was a kid, and then realized that was probably not a great long-term profession, just financially.
Right.
What kind of history did you study? Something specific, or was it just kind of like general? Like, how did that work?
Yeah, so I took a lot of courses in Imperial Spain, Caribbean history
Okay.
was kind of my forte. So I wrote my thesis paper on you know capitalism kind of growing in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and kind of what that means for
Mm-hmm.
modern our modern economy, and where that comes from historically. I will say, I don't make money with my history degree. However, the amount of research that I had to do to write those papers is basically the same kind of research I do to run a business now. So going going
Mm-hmm.
and finding leads and like where do I contact the leads and researching them. It's the same thing. Oh, you write this document on Imperial Spain. Let's get all the magistrates in this little district and see what they had to say, and you put all the
Wow.
pieces together, and then you're like,
Uh,
okay,
that is super. I do Blinkist, which is, I don't know if you heard of Blinkist before, but it's like kind of like Cliff Notes for audiobooks, and it'll like, there was one the other day that was
okay,
called Guns, Germs, and Steel. I don't know if you heard of that book before, but it seems like it's right up your alley. It's about like how, uh, like the reason why Spain and those other countries, just because of the geography being like east to west instead of north to south, let them grow crops like a lot easier. Than the whole civilization and agriculture like matured a lot faster,
really,
which allowed them to kind of get the edge on the rest of the world basically. But a very cool book. So very very interesting. I love the kind of
that's
tie.
cool.
So I mean, obviously there's a little bit of time between 22 when you did that business and Project Talent Group. What did you kind of fill the time with in between there?
So I came back to the United States. This was in 2011, and that was kind of right after the, I guess whatever, the Great Recession, right? So I was coming out of college 2010, and New Orleans didn't have like the best, I think, economy for somebody like a business person, unless you're like a professional, like accountant, lawyer, doctor. I mean, there are some industries, but there was
Mm-hmm.
it was struggling for a little while after Katrina. I think now they're economically thriving and things like that. But I remember I like the only job I could get was a door to door sales job. And it was like commission only, right? So I would go door to door trying to sell like New Orleans
Right.
Hornets tickets to people in parking
Right.
lots, things like that. It was before Groupon. So I'd have these like promotional advertising like tickets, and then but it was actually business to business. So I would go in the buildings, and just go into the office and say, hey, I got this thing for sale. Sometimes there were golf courses, like Planet Beach, things like that, and ultimately that company moved me to Houston, Texas, which so I stayed in New Orleans. It was a short stint, after coming back from Brazil, and then I moved to Houston, and then I was doing that for another 6 more months, and then I got a base salary job
Mm-hmm.
at an IT
Right.
telecommunications company. Same thing, cold calling, and yeah, I mean I blew it out the water actually at that job. So
Mm-hmm.
like this was like kind of when LinkedIn was starting to become a thing, and then they gave me this territory to work. Like, hey, this is your zip code, but if you
Right.
have someone in your personal network, you can sell to that person. So I was like, all right, they gave me this zip code. I didn't sell anyone in that zip code, So I went on LinkedIn and I started finding people from my high school alumni association, from
Mm-hmm.
Tulane Alumni Association, and just started building relationships, man. And then then I gave a training on LinkedIn and how to use it, and then it
Wow.
kind of changed the landscape
And
of
I have to
how they're doing
imagine
business now.
that as a business owner, those days conditioned you very well for the things you have to do today.
Oh yeah, I mean I think all that experience,
Right.
like if I would have tried to start this 10 years ago, probably no shot. You know what I mean? Um, just the level of because I remember I'd be in these calls with people and I'd have to bring a SME in
Right.
to figure out what the company's needs were because I didn't understand. I didn't even know what I
Right.
was selling. I was like, all right, here, let me just go. Let's go door to door. Like, here, do you want to buy it? Like, I know it's good. It's a good product, and ultimately that's what I learned about business is just it's just relationships, and the relationships. It's not a. And what I did learn in my sales career is that I was trying to be everybody's friend,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes people would just be wasting my time, kind of thing. They wouldn't have a need. I'd be talking to them for months.
Right.
Now I've learned the relationship is built over fulfilling the needs. So now I just go after the need and build the relationship and the foundation from that. Because ultimately, the service we provide is we're transforming companies through empowering people. So I get to be the matchmaker between
Right.
changing someone's life
Wow.
via their career
No, I
and
love
helping a
that. I love
company
that sales
transform.
experience. Um, I hear that from a lot of business or more on the coaching side and the marketing side. They always recommend business owners have some sort of sales training or experience. You know what I mean? It's until I personally, and I've said this on a few episodes, but I can't even remember where I heard it now. But somebody was like, name the, maybe it was the Fanatical Prospecting book, Jeb Blount or whatever. But he was like, name the top 5 things you think of when you hear the word salesman, and it's like pest or like annoying, and like all these things that like kind of prevent people, I think, business owners and founders, etc., from really going after it because they don't want to be the sales guy that they've been annoyed with their entire life, right? Have you found that to kind of ring true with you?
Right. Yeah, a little bit. I mean, in my industry, I guess I'm a sales-centric CEO, where I think the CEO of any company is a sales role because ultimately you're marketing your brand, you're marketing the product, what your business is doing, the vision, and all. So kind of transition into this it was a nice flow. I did find that yeah, people can get upset when you reach out, but you know
Yep.
for me, it's not about it's. You might get 9 no's, but it's all about that one yes. You know what I mean? So persistence is key. A lot of people aren't made out for sales. So I've seen a lot of people
Right.
wash out.
Yeah. No,
Like if you
that's.
make
I
it
think
past the
that's the
first,
key
I'd
is
say
the
3 years, you're probably gonna
once,
stay.
and that's kind of what I was alluding to. Is like once I did realize that I was a salesman, because people would ask me like, "Oh, what are you, the sales guy for your company?" I'm like, "No, like, what do you mean? I'm the CEO. I'm not the sales guy." But once I realized I am the sales guy, the light kind of turned on and business opened up. So, um, typically, I ask what your first business was you started, but you already went over that, so that's pretty cool. Um, tell me about Project Talent. Like, where did that come from? Like, where did it grow out of?
Okay. So I worked in the telecommunications industry for 3.5 years, and then I got into staffing in 2014. So 9 years ago, strictly on the business development side. Worked for a lot of different agencies, and then it became pretty clear. I was like, this is not that difficult to do. I was like, well, I was really passionate about it. However, I felt like a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
organizations I worked for were kind of trying to mold me into the messaging that they wanted me to say, right? They're like, hey, well, say this. This is what you're supposed to say. And then that wouldn't work. And then when I would say the things I wanted to say, it would work, right? So ultimately, when I started Project Talent Group, I just did it my way. And, we got 40 signed clients, 4 full-time employees now. I mean, we're growing really, really fast. And for me, it's all about the authentic self. So, at Project Talent, we really, it's like be cool, be you. I don't want to get in your way, but just kind of you go set the world on fire by being your
Right.
authentic self to the customer. Because ultimately, if it's relationships, you can't really quantify a human into a robot. So I think a lot of these bigger companies, and that's why there's a lot of turnover, is they try to kind of put you into their platform and like this is how you have to be. And for me personally, that didn't work for me. So ultimately, that's why I wanted to
Wow.
branch
Well,
out and start my own thing, and
congratulations. You
then
have
here we
weathered
are.
the
Actually,
first
we're coming up on a
year
year
of
and
storms.
five
I'm
days.
sure there's been lots of challenges along the way. Um, what were some of the things that set you back initially from starting? Like, what kind of what were reasons why you didn't start sooner?
uh, I think there's probably a little bit of fear, you know, and I was like, I want to do this, but I realized everything that I want is on the other side of fear. So fear is false evidence appearing real, or face everything and rise. And then when I started
How
getting
did you
into the practice of just consistently
attack
facing my
such
fear,
a
I grew into who I
crowded
was supposed to
space?
be. So yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. Sales is sales, right? I think it has to do with the amount of outreaches, and it's also the relationships that you build. It's the like going back to the authenticity. It's like, okay, so when I started out, my brand's Nick Balée, right? So let me go out and make as many connections as possible. So um, I probably reached out to, I want to say, 50,000 prospects. Because I realized that kind of based off my kind of
Mm-hmm.
previous ratios, I was like, all right, for every 1,000 phone calls that I did,
Right.
would convert to one deal. So I was like, so how do I do that? as many times as possible. So I just basically I wrote out a plan. I was like, all right, this is how many numbers it's going to take to get, a customer. And then once I get the customer, I got to fulfill the need. So if I get as many customers as possible,
Did
I'm going to
you was
have
it
a better shot
and
at,
you don't have to get
closing
into
the
it too
deal.
much, but
So
what
I just played with numbers,
mechanism
man. That's what I did.
did you use for outreach? Was that phone calls? Was it emails? Was it LinkedIn? Was it a combination of those things, or?
Yeah, it was a combination. What I realized is it's been
Mm-hmm.
mostly email marketing. So it's funny because I used to do like 200 calls a day in some call centers and maybe talk to one person or two people or whatever. But people seem to be a lot more receptive to the digital marketing, email marketing,
Right.
LinkedIn. It's just, hey, here's what I do. This is who I am. Um, Let me know if you need help without really trying to push it that much. Because that's what I learned too. Because you were talking about earlier about how sales can come off as pushy and that kind of methodology. It's not.
Mm-hmm.
I learned over time, and I used to be like that when I was younger, but over time, that's just not how it works. People aren't receptive to that. And there's nothing wrong with like putting your name out there and trying to get business. That's we're in America. This is who we are. So I kind of got into that psychological perspective, of service, and I'm trying to fulfill. So I've done a lot of self help
Mm-hmm.
books. I've read a lot of stuff. It's about being in alignment with helping others. So when I'm helping others and I focus on that, then it's not as transactional. It's
So
more
is
of a
that
relationship, and I'm
based
trying to
off of a
give.
specific
And
sales
then
strategy
when
that
I
you
give,
use, or
that's
is
when it
it
comes back,
kind of just something
as
you
opposed to
develop
trying to go and
over
take.
time yourself?
I've been
What would be your
through
most
probably
recommended
9 or 10 different sales
book or
trainings,
sales
and
training
this is a
to a business
conglomeration of all
owner who
those.
doesn't have a bunch of sales experience? Okay. All
So
right,
I
I'll
would
put
say
those in the
Sandler
notes.
sales training is a good one, as well as Brian Tracy, Psychology of Sales. So he talks about the mind, because it all starts here. Because when you're on the phone with somebody, they can feel your energy. So if you're in a place where I got to hit a number, I'm going to do this, I got to do that, that's not authentic. So that's why I keep bringing it back to the
So
authenticity
how do you
piece,
balance
which is like
keeping
everyone
that
that works here, it's like, hey, just be
authenticity, but
you, be
also
calm, just talk to
kind
me.
of wrangling your
That's
team
really how we get things done
into
here.
a brand or a kind of some set of standard operating procedures? Like how do you kind of balance the two?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So every organization needs structure, right? And organizational development, and you need sales to move things forward. You need ops to kind of hold things together. I learned that early in my career because I was getting all these deals in, right? And then the team couldn't fulfill it because I was bringing in way too fast. So I was like, okay, well, I have to listen to the internal side. It's just different sides of the brain. So I was a high I on a disc assessment, and a lot of people in operations and finance are like conscientious or
Mm-hmm.
S's. So I learned the different communication styles and how to articulate where a deal was, because sales is also, it's
Right.
external sales,
Interesting.
but it's internal sales within the organization. Like I can bring a deal in, then I got to sell my team on, hey, let's work this order. So that's kind of how you know one of the things that we figured out here is what everybody's role is. So now we're working in sync. You know, if like we kind of made this
Mm-hmm.
analogy to like a band playing music. Like if one person's off chord or off key, the whole song is off. So we're all in key right now. I'm running sales.
Right.
Got the
Interesting.
somebody
I like the
working
band
on
analogy. It's
recruiting.
a
I got
good one.
another guy doing ops.
Um,
So and
what
it's
do you,
just
how
we're
did
just
you
now just a
start?
like in sync unit.
And you mentioned your kind of 50,000 prospect approach, which is very interesting. But did you start with a niche in mind, with like kind of who you were going after, or did you define that, and is that still changing today?
Yeah, that's another a good question. So my background is mostly IT engineering, a little bit of finance. So I kind of started with that. So, my first big customer was a big software company here in Philadelphia, and you know, made a bunch of placements early on, had some success, started bringing people on board to try to expand into other verticals. So
Mm-hmm.
now, our
Interesting.
verticals now we did find our niche basically. So it's IT, engineering, financial services, and legal, and we don't do anything else outside of that. Because in the beginning I did, we got a lot of jobs that were just completely outside of the wheelhouse, and we were just spinning our wheels trying to fill an order.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all about kind of being an expert in a couple of areas, and then that's because ultimately our product is our talent, our ability to find talent. So we try to recruit in the same verticals. So let's say, hey, you come to me, I need
Mm-hmm.
to hire an IT project manager. Well, cool, I got four other
Got it.
clients that
Wow.
I'm
Very.
I'm
I like that
recruiting on for
answer.
the same position. Here's some people that are
So,
warm in the pipeline. So
so you
it's
mentioned your first
faster speed
customer, and
to
I don't want you to
market because
mention him by
delivery is
name.
everything.
But how did you get that first customer?
So it was actually from that initial email outreach.
Right.
So I had this database of emails, and then I just started downloading names, and going back to that history paper kind of research methodology where, hey, let's so basically I found target size companies that I wanted to work with, and I knew there would be low barrier to entry, and then I just reached out to who I knew the decision makers were that were probably going to have a need in the area that I focus on, and then I reached out to all of them in Philly, and then I got in a really nice sized client that had you know multiple
Mm-hmm.
jobs, and he had a terrible experience with recruiters in the past. They weren't giving him the time of day. They didn't want to focus. So I was like, okay, well, let me do the best that I can. So I actually was working
um,
like
that's
90 hours a
interesting.
week to
A
fill
lot
that
of
order,
people, their first
and
customer
then
was
I got
somebody
them all filled,
from
and
their previous
he's a
life,
he's one of my best clients today.
friend, family, whatever. But yours, I think, based off of your pretty strong sales background, was from a more traditional sales outreach campaign, right? That's an interest. It's different, which kind of speaks to uh, your strength in that area, right? Because a lot of people probably wouldn't even if they had 50,000 contacts, wouldn't know what the hell to do with them, right? So the fact that you were able to go through those and then land a sizable client is impressive. Um, so if you had to kind of take everything, and you actually
Right.
alluded to it a little bit earlier, if you had to kind of take everything you know today, and if you were to
Thank you.
start Project Talent Group over tomorrow, what would be your first step? Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, that's a good question because now we're kind of coming up on the year, and I just kind of wrote out the business plan, like where we are as a business. It would really be coming up with some pretty hard boundaries about what we're going to work
Mm-hmm.
and what we're not going to work. Like these are the payment terms. This is the kind of contract we want. Because I got a lot of contracts in the beginning that were just all over the place. Like net 90, net 60. Um, so and in verticals that were just kind of all over. Like I got a healthcare client that wanted to hire doctors, and just couldn't find anyone for that. So if I was
Yeah,
going to
that
start
makes
it from
sense.
scratch again, I would just say, hey,
I
I'm
think a
just
lot of
going to
companies or a lot of
only do
founders,
IT,
and I mean,
nothing
I was
else,
guilty of it too. And
and
it sounds
then
like you had a
whatever
little bit
comes
of it
after
when you
that,
started. This was
we'll grow from there.
you got you have to balance taking in everything, so you have business and you start keeping the lights on and all that sort of stuff, which causes those 90-hour work weeks to start. But you have to balance that with eventually just stretching yourself so thin that you're not being effective anymore, right? All right, well let's change gears a little bit. What are three things that you're kind of doing on a daily, weekly, monthly, whatever basis um, to kind of
Right.
increase your longevity, to make sure you're healthy for as long as you possibly can be?
Sure. One thing that I've learned about growth is that you can't grow in a place of comfortability. And, I used to be somebody that would avoid uncomfortable conversations. So now with my team, we're just in the day to day, like having uncomfortable conversations with like where we're at, how do we grow, where are we going to focus on in those core areas, and being able to listen and take that in and grow from that. I think that's really helped us kind of figure out where we're going as a business. In terms of what we do weekly and day to day, like we have like a recruiting engine. I like to call it a recruiting engine because one of my business partners is into cars. He loves cars. It's got to be a well-oiled machine, right? So we have our process in place with that. So every week we have a whiteboard meeting where I track where we're at with interviews, what process we are with the client, and then I look at the sales pipeline. Like, hey, these are the clients that we're in warm conversations with.
Very cool.
Like, how do we activate those, and then keep moving things through the pipeline. So we have like closest to the dollar, and then you have like B order, C order, D order, and then it's just about moving things through to close.
Got it.
So we do that. We do that about like Monday and Friday. We'll touch base in the beginning. Hey, this is where we're at. We're setting weekly targets, and then at the end of the week, Friday today, we're like, hey, did we hit our target? And instead of doing these stretch goals, like, hey, this is our 5-10 year plan. I kind of actually make an analogy to a football team, because when the Saints won the Super Bowl, I remember Drew Brees and Sean Payton talking about, we're just going to focus on this week. They're not talking about what's going to happen in the playoffs or anything like that. It was just like the next team that's coming. They got their process. That's what they're doing. So we've gotten really into like the day-to-day grind, but
Makes
also
sense.
just
what about you
this
personally? What are you doing
next
to
week, and then, not trying to set these. We have
increase
our
your
long
longevity
targets,
and your
but
health?
it's about kind of staying in the moment and focusing on what we can do today. Yeah, that's a great question. So I work out pretty frequently. I basically created some blackout hours. So after 7 p.m., I don't take any business calls, or I don't like to try to talk about work or anything like that. I hang out with my family. My little sister lives in Philadelphia. We hang out pretty frequently, and I try to disconnect my brain a little bit from work as much as possible when I'm not working. I play a lot of chess, so get into hobbies and things like that. Got a lot of friends going to a barbecue tonight. So, and then I'll just try to shut it down and just
like
hey,
that.
let me just not talk about work.
All right, so
for,
mystery question time.
Just like a couple hours. So
if
I
you
just
could
lowered the
do
amount
anything in the world,
with the ability to
and you knew you couldn't
more
fail
focused
at
during
it,
business hours.
what would you do? Dude, see, my man, got a good answer. See,
I could do anything
I
in the
have a
world,
lot of variation of that
what would
answer.
I do?
I love just the real, raw, just like do
do
something crazy that you
I don't know,
probably
man.
would
I
die
probably
at.
want to go to
if-
space.
but
Try to go
but
there.
you can't fail, so it's a great. I love that. I'm a huge space nerd, so I love that answer. Are you a roller coasters guy? Do you like drops and roller coasters and stuff? See, I'm not. So
Right.
Which is weird being a pilot or student pilot. Those two things usually don't go together. But go to space. That is the first answer I've gotten about that, and I love it.
Yeah.
So, all right, well, let's end it there, man. This was great. This is probably one of the more tactical episodes I've had, where I think people, if they're looking to start a business, there's some really concrete stuff that we talked about that would be helpful to them. So thank you for coming on. I'll be down in the city tonight. It's big Taylor Swift night in the city. My wife is super excited for the Taylor Swift concert. As you can tell by my face, I'm not quite as excited, but no, I'm just happy that she's gonna be happy. It's Mother's Day weekend. You gotta. I'll be happy for her to go. So we'll be down there tonight. But other than that, brother, it's been great, and I'll talk to you soon. All right. Thanks for coming on.
All right.
Thanks. See you, man.